much more to be said about that technical standard. There's no proposal ready. It's a very slow and lengthy process. But I wanted all of you to know that there's some community representation there, and it's the three of us that are on the call tonight. So now, Linda mentioned it, that these site-specific standards that now we're gonna just focus on, that they're basically for industry players that cannot meet the current air standard for Ontario. Why can't they meet it? It's a little bit inherent to their operation. Steel mills fall into that. There's other heavy industry that falls into that. And the effects are shown in the slide in front of you. So I just want to start with that slide. Basically, you see the three colors. You see the green surrounding, you see the purple circle, and you see the yellow circle. What this is actually that map has been calculated by the Ministry of the Environment, and it's basically a computer simulation, adding all the industry that we have here in Hamilton and any other known sources to the ministry, but it's mainly 3-4 sources here in Hamilton. And they basically said what they did is a cumulative study, because the current site-specific standards, they allow the same limit for theoretically an unlimited number of facilities. They could be side by side, like we have here in Hamilton, Stelco and Dofasco. They're literally side by side. But the site-specific standard does not take this into consideration. So what we have here in Hamilton specifically is like a compounding effect, because we have 2 steel mills, and then we have like a subcontractor to one of the steel mills that adds to it. And we have a fourth company that processes the coal tar from the steel mills here in Hamilton, and also Nanticoke and some other facilities throughout North America. And this map here specifically targets 2 contaminants. One is benzene. I'm going to talk about the contaminants a little bit in more detail in just a minute. So one is benzene and the other one is benzoapyrene. They're both carcinogens. That's why they're of interest not only to us, but obviously also of interest for the Ministry of Environment. So they sort of superimposed all those risks of those 2 substances and of all the emitters here in Hamilton. And what you see now is the green surrounding, and you can go to this map, and if you zoom out, you're not going to find any other purple spots. You'll find a little purple spot in Sarnia. You will not find any other yellow spots in Ontario. So I would call Hamilton a hot spot. The green surrounding is what the Ministry of Environment sees as an acceptable risk for the average population to develop cancer over their lifetime. And that risk, and that's a very common standard, is 1 person in 1 million people that live in that area. From there, we go to the purple level, and it goes always tenfold between those color levels. So the purple risk is 10 in 1 million, or 1 in 100,000, if you like that better, that 1 in comparison. So the risk in the purple zone is 10 times elevated already above what is assumed as acceptable. And then once we go to the yellow one, again, it goes up tenfold. So if you, like you people from the beach neighborhood where you are living, you're solid in that yellow zone. This means over a lifetime of living there, you have a 1 in 10,000 chance of developing cancer just because of those 2 carcinogens. Obviously, this doesn't take into consideration any other exposure you might have, right? you may work somewhere else, exposed to anything else, and your personal life, etc. Just by living in this area and breathing that air, now your risk of developing cancer goes up 100 times versus what's acceptable and what the average, most of the average Ontario population has in their air shed. Now, I already mentioned benzene and benzoate. Just want to briefly walk you through, because those are the contaminants that those postings now from the ministry are about. And I guess there's no way to do it without being a little bit technical, but basically in a nutshell, benzene, you get benzene when you burn any fossil fuels. If you burn oil, coal, gasoline, it comes out of your vehicle exhaust. So even simple things as driving on the highway, you expose yourself to higher benzene levels. Those I all see as it's by choice. By living in a certain neighborhood and growing up there, living your whole life there, that's not necessarily by choice. You should have a right to have clean air there. What you do outside that, yes, we all expose ourselves to certain levels there. So that's so therefore it's easy to see why benzene comes out of the the steel mills. Both steel mills in Hamilton have coke facilities there. What that is basically you put coal and you starve it of oxygen. And what you get there is coke. Coke is an essential part in the steel making process. But by doing so, you have those benzene emissions. Long-term exposure of benzene can lead to various disorders, mainly in the blood. They can reduce the number of red blood cells. They can ultimately lead to leukemia and associated cancers like that. And as this map in front of us already shows, that those exposures, they're very real. They also can be backed up by the air measurement network that we have, Ham and Air. For instance, there is a monitor in the beach neighborhood. And if one looks at those values also, one can very quickly see that, yes, there are elevated levels, not only in a computer modeling, but also in real life. The second kind of related compound, we're going to talk about it. There's no ministry posting yet, but it will come very, very soon. I guess we've been told it will come in January, and that's benzoate. It falls into a group of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, they're abbreviated typically and referred to. So this is one of them. This is the one that has been the best studied. Like benzene, it's a proven carcinogen. And for that reason, obviously, it's regulated by the Ministry of Environment, and we have a very high interest in not exposing ourselves to it. Again, it comes from combustion of fossil fuels. Coke oven operations is also in vehicle emissions again. So we see a little bit, the overlap with benzene there. Benzoate is typically a solid up to temperature of around 170 degrees. So it's mainly associated with fine particulates in the air. And as I mentioned, it's a known carcinogen. Once it gets into your body, let's say through, by breathing it in, it goes through your lungs and it gets distributed very quickly throughout your whole body. And the body stores it in fatty tissue and in bone marrow. So again, ultimately, it can lead to forms of cancer there. Now, what's the next substance that is in the commenting right now would be that suspended particulate matter. What that is basically all particles, regardless of size, they get combined in this category. and the ministry prescribes a certain maximum level that is allowable under the site-specific standard. This in itself has already a little bit of a big disadvantage, because the combining of all particles is not really like the current kind of gold standard in assessing health risks, etc. Everybody has really moved on to further define it. There's a particulate matter 10, short PM10, and then there's PM 2.5. The PM10 is inhalable, so it means it will go through your nasal tract and make its way into the lungs, but typically it would stop there. The PM 2.5, the number refers to the size of it. So the smaller the number, the further it can go in your body. The PM 2.5 is respirable, and it can make its way into the bloodstream. So obviously, it is of high interest, what that particulate is. In general, particulate is never good, even if it's a substance that is not typically harmful. But it gets more concerning, like I mentioned, with benzoapyrene, that typically you would see that associated in fine particulate. And that fine particulate is really of concern, because the heavy particulate, there's a pretty high chance it may not even leave the site of that industry. It may just come down, fall out of the sky, literally within the vicinity of the steel mills. But the finer you go, if you go to the 2.5, that can stay suspended sometimes for days. So the wind can easily carry it, and it can carry it in multiple directions. We don't know exactly when it will come down either. So that's obviously of concern. Negative effects for particulate in general, it affects the lungs and the cardiovascular system. It can lead to heart problems, can also lead to a decreased lung function and respiratory symptoms such as difficulty breathing. So now, since we're in this pandemic, again, the particulate matter we're exposed to is already less than ideal, but in this pandemic situation, it's even more worrisome, because difficulty breathing, that would be something associated also with COVID-19 symptoms. The last pollutant we're going to talk about, or that is mentioned in the ministry commenting areas, that would be manganese. So the manganese obviously comes from the steel making operation now itself. Manganese is used as an alloy to make steel. There's other elements that go into that steel. Manganese is of concern because, again, it would enter, our body, in this case, most likely through the air, and it can enter our nervous system and our brain and cause, negative effects there in terms of just our behavior. It can slow down movements of people that have been exposed to high levels of it. It can also irritate the lungs, again, in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Not very great. It's never great, obviously, but it's a double negative. And for children, it can affect their brain development. So it's easy to see from any of those pollutants that obviously they're worrisome to us in the community. And it's also easy to see why the Ministry of Environment would obviously wanna regulate those pollutants. So I guess Linda is gonna walk you through to some of the more specific now, those postings regarding those pollutants and regarding also the different players, because now I guess it gets a little bit complex because there's just so many things parallel. So I hand over the word to you, Linda.
Thanks, Johan, and thank you for walking through all of that. I think think that was really great for giving people a good sense of why we need to be concerned and why we continue to push for the levels of these contaminants admitted to air to be reduced sooner than later. So I'm going to just start to introduce to you more details about the proposals that are currently posted on the provincial, it's called the Environmental Registry of Ontario, for public comment. And very quickly, for those of you who don't know, in Ontario, we are very lucky that we still have, hopefully we'll continue to have, an environmental bill of rights, and not every province and territory in Canada has one. In fact, there aren't a lot of jurisdictions in the world that do. And it gives us all some very basic rights, and that includes the right to comment, to be notified and to comment when the government is making environmentally significant decisions. Not all provincial governments respect that all the time. And I can tell you this current government hasn't always, but in this case, these postings are actually on the registry, so we know they're there, and we will be able to comment. So right now, we know that both ArcelorMittal Dofasco and Stelco in Hamilton have applied to extend their current site-specific standards. And you'll remember I described those. Those are the alternative air pollution limits that they've applied for. So they already have some. They want more time for them. In this case, in the case of ArcelorMittal Dofasco, that also includes a third application, and that application is on the registry, is from a company called Harsco Canada. So Harsco operates on Arcelor's site, and they manage ArcelorMittal Dofasco's slag, and slag is a kind of a byproduct of steel production. It's also tends to be where the issues with manganese in particulate are emerging. So I just wanted to make sure that you all understand that the two mills in Hamilton currently have site-specific standards for the following contaminants. For both Stelco and Dofasco, they have site-specific standards for benzoate-pyrene, and as Johan has already mentioned, that one isn't posted right now, expires in June of next year. They both have SSSs for benzene. That one also doesn't expire until June of next year. They both have SSSs for suspended particulate matter. That expires at the end of December of this year. And then only Arcelor has a site-specific standard for manganese, and that also doesn't expire until June of next year. So again, because Stelco's Hamilton Works is not fully operational, they make coke and they have some finishing lines, but they're not doing the entire primary steel production process like Dofasco. They don't have any slag handling, so they don't have that issue with manganese. But those are the four. And so just to recap, so in other words, for all of these contaminants, the mills are unable to meet those regulatory limits set out in Reg 419, and they have had to pursue that other route to compliance, namely the site-specific standard, in order to get into compliance with the air quality regulation. Okay, so I just want to shift now to talking to you about what is essentially being proposed as the pathway forward through these applications that are on the environmental registry right now for public comment. So in the case of everything from benzoate-pyrene, because they're not going to deal with that till January, the ministry is proposing to extend the site-specific standards. So that's for suspended particulate matter, for benzene, and for manganese to June of 2023. And they're proposing to do that by keeping those site-specific standards at the current levels. So that alternative standard that's been set for each of the mills for those contaminants, the ministry is saying, for the next 2.5 years, we're going to keep that the same. They're also not requiring any update to the action plans that go with those site-specific standards. So if you remember earlier, I talked about site-specific standards as there are two pieces. There's that alternative standard, that level is set, and then the company has to develop an action plan and demonstrate continuous progress, working to reduce the emission levels of the contaminant for which they have a site-specific standard. So what the ministry is proposing here is we're going to keep it the same. We're not going to ratchet that site-specific standard down and make it more stringent, and we're not going to require an update to the action plan over that 2.5-year period. And what the ministry is also saying is we're already in the process of developing that industry-wide standard. So you remember that was the third route to compliance that I described. So they're almost saying like, this is just sort of an interim measure while we work to get that other option there. so that the industries, once that other option is in place, they can opt to sign on to that industry standard, or they can continue under the current system. So we have concerns about that, because 2.5 years is a long time to maintain the status quo, rather than aggressively, as the regulator, requiring these companies to continue to do better. And as we said, there's no proposal yet for how the ministry intends to address the site-specific standard for benzoate-pyrene. But it's important to note that benzoate-pyrene is an incredibly potent carcinogen. So our sense is that's probably part of the reason why the ministry hasn't decided yet, and we're hopeful that we will see an extension that does include a requirement for more stringent levels to be met and more action to be taken. But there certainly is a strong argument to be made that we should be doing that for all of these. So I'm going to run through, and I'm sorry, I know there are lots of numbers here. And this chart is also in the handout package that you'll be able to get a look at. So what we've done is we've just compiled all of the information that we have around the current site-specific standards for each of these contaminants at all of these facilities. So you'll see this first slide focuses on the suspended particulate matter, and you can see that Arcelor first received a site-specific standard for SPM back in July of 2010. And you can see the level that it was set at. And we've also included the actual standard, the regulatory limit that's set out in Reg 419, so that you can get a sense of where they're at and what the actual ideal limit is if there was full compliance. So in the case of ArcelorMittal, you can see back in July of 2010, the ministry gave them that alternative standard that's not as stringent, so 177 micrograms per standard cubic meter of air versus the standard, which is 120. But if you look across, you'll see that it's the same in February of 2015, and they're proposing moving forward that it'll be the same from January 2021 to June of 2023. So we see that and really wonder, like, what the heck, 10 years later, and we're not seeing a ratcheting down. So you hope you can understand why we're arguing that we need to be pushing for more. And then you can see for the Harsco slag handling area, Harsco didn't have a site-specific standard in that first phase. And then the ministry realized, no, we should have a separate one for them. So they're within the same property, so they've been set at the same level. But again, the pattern is the same in terms of not making it more stringent for this extension period. And then you can see for Stelco Hamilton Works, in that period from July 2010 to February 2015, there's nothing there because Stelco was struggling through bankruptcy. And when an industry finds itself in that situation, the regulator doesn't impose requirements like this, apparently. So we didn't see that development of a site-specific standard. But if you look in February, you'll see the standard was set at 313 micrograms per meter square, and they're proposing the same for January 2021 to June of 2023. And we're kind of scratching our heads over this one because this facility, as I explained earlier, isn't fully operational. So we're not quite sure why their limit is so high. And we have asked that question. We're waiting to hear back from the ministry, and we'll certainly share that with you if we get that information. But again, it's the same argument that this is, 313, that's more than double what the regulatory limit is. And we think that should not be that high with no solid requirement for continuous progress over the next 2.5 years. This is what the...
Linda, could David just interrupt? Would you
Sure,
be able
ahead,
to
David.
Explain to the group that these are actually done by modeling?
Sure, yeah. So just so people understand, so these levels are, in fact, actually with the site-specific standards, and David, I'm not sure if the same happened with Algoma, but the ministry used a combined modeling and monitoring to really get a sense of how they should set these levels. But you're right, these companies, at least on an annual basis, they'll do an emissions summary and dispersion modeling report, and it is very much based on modeling. So that's another thing that happens, is there's always this sort of tension, I know, at least in our community, where we push for actual monitoring to be combined with the modeling. But yes, oftentimes, even in terms of assessing compliance, it is often very much focused on modeling more than actually monitoring out in the community. Thanks for that, David. So when it comes to benzene, here's what the numbers look like. They've been set differently for the different mills because the reality is, I mean, in the case of Arcelor, this is where it makes a little bit more sense for benzene because they have multiple coke plants and the Stelco Hamilton Works only has one. So you can see over time, we did see a sort of progressive ratcheting down of the site-specific standard for benzene. And that's the kind of trend that we like to see in the community because we want it to get lower. And again, if you look all the way to the end, you'll see where the actual standard is. So the companies are there. It's a very stringent standard and they are still substantially higher. But again, the question needs to be asked, why are we not seeing any sort of commitment to ratchet down for that January 2021 to June 2023 period, given all that you've heard Johan explain in terms of the concerns about benzene. And then finally, this is what the chart looks like for manganese. We didn't see a site-specific standard for manganese come into play until July of 2016. But again, you know, we've got a scenario here where 5 years later and over that 2.5-year period, we don't see a ratcheting down. So with all of these, our concern there is the same, just in terms of how this is being approached. So as I say, that chart is in the handout that we can provide for you, but we really did want to share numbers with you and also give you a way to very quickly and easily compare those numbers to the actual regulatory limit. I don't know, is it, Johan, do you think it makes sense to maybe ask if there are any questions now before we jump into preparing comments? We definitely are going to leave time at the end for questions, but maybe if anyone has a burning question about anything that Johan and I have talked about so far, maybe it makes sense to give people a chance to ask. So if you do have a question, maybe just unmute yourself and feel free to jump in.
Type it in. Hello?
Hello?
It's Paul here. Yeah.
Hi, Paul.
Can you or Johan talk at some point about comparing our standards to US standards? Because my understanding is the US standards, I could be wrong about the percentage, it could be 50% better, or that they have higher this is surprising because we think Donald Trump has torn apart all the standards, but apparently they do have higher steel industry standards in the US. And can you allude to that at all or somewhere in your slides?
Sure. I can start, and I'm sure Johan will probably want to add. Yeah, we are very much aware of more stringent approaches to regulating the steel industry south of the border that, yeah, I guess haven't been completely hacked away by the outgoing president. For instance, you know, I talked about industry standards and the very prescriptive operations and maintenance procedures. I can tell you that right now within the site-specific standards for these mills, there are orders associated with them that have basically almost completely adopted some of those prescriptive requirements that exist for coke plants in the United States, because it's the coke plants and the coke ovens that are the main source of these contaminants of concern. And I know that by the time they were adopted and phased in for steel mills in Ontario, we were already about 20 years behind where the United States already was. Another thing to note, in just comparing Ontario to how the US EPA regulates the sector, when we talk about industry standards, and you check the box by putting in what's supposed to be maximum available control technology, and you combine it with good operations and maintenance practices, and in Ontario you're done unless a director in the ministry says, wait a minute, we want to circle back and do a reassessment. In the US, that's a legislated part of the process. So you put in your technology, you do the good operations and maintenance, and then after a certain period of time, you have to circle back and demonstrate that there's no residual risk, that there aren't still harmful levels of some of these contaminants being emitted. So that piece is weaker, I would argue, on the Ontario side, because it's not automatic. It's kind of I'm not going to say the whim, but at the discretion of a director within the ministry. As the public, we always like when it's a legislated requirement that can't be messed with. Johan, you may want to jump in and add more on this.
I just have one comment around that topic. It's a little bit more on, has to do with economics for the steel mills. One observation that I also have is basically that our air standards for the steel mills, they have a limitation in terms of how stringent they can be, because the ministry says even in the site-specific standard postings that basically no limit shall be imposed on the companies that would disadvantage them against competitors in the same jurisdiction. And then I think they mentioned specifically North America. So Canada, no, not Canada, Ontario, we limit ourselves in terms of how good we can ever do when this wording stays, unless it gets removed. We can pretty much, based on that wording, never be a leader and do better than the US. We can never look abroad and say, oh, let's just, for the sake of brainstorming, look at worldwide that industry, what's new there. So we disadvantage ourselves basically by the Ministry of Environment also holding a sort of economic protection umbrella over the industry. That's my personal read is pretty much that it's not only a Ministry of Environment, it has a little bit of a Ministry of Industry and Trade, etc., built in by always making that dual judgment. And when it comes to adopting the US standards, yes, like Linda mentioned, we always lag behind, at least 1 decade, if not decades. And if there's options to choose from, so far Ontario has always chosen the easiest option. One specific example is we've recently learned that even for the coke ovens, there's different standards, as one can imagine, depending on what their physical shape is. Ontario looked at both those shapes in the US regulation, but then they said, the heck with it, we'll just pick the one that allows for higher emissions, and we allow anybody that runs a coke battery in Ontario to run it like this. So yeah, I see we're disadvantaging ourselves for the sake of I guess supporting that industry on an economic level a little bit.
And one more quick comment, and this is for anybody, if you're interested in seeing areas where they've got even tighter limits. Within the U.S., we always hear about Allegheny County, and Allegheny County is in the Pittsburgh area, and there's a whole lot of Pittsburgh's a lot like the Hamilton of the South. And so in that area, it's like the public health district that seems to have some clout, and they've got even stricter requirements. There are a number of coke oven production plants down there, one owned by US Steel, and I think there are others in the area too. So even stricter rules there. So we often will hear ministry folks up here make reference to those Allegheny rules. So that's the other reality, that there are some sub-jurisdictions in the US that have even tougher rules, and so there's always value, if you really get into this, to start to look at those and see if you can push for that sort of thing to happen up here.
Linda, I just have a question, if you don't mind. It's Terry.
Sure.
So I think I'm understanding what Joe had just said, but it's a lot for me to absorb given that this is my first exposure to this. But so the Reg 419 is sort of sounds like a wish list more than anything else. I'm not sure what enforces it, or other than, I haven't seen anything surface yet. But there seems to be the SSS, which sounds sort of like a scapegoat for these companies if they're not meeting Reg 419. So if that's the case, and there is a process in place if you are falling short of where you're supposed to be, other than the process, is there some sort of economic penalty that's associated to not meeting 419? So once they
Yeah.
apply for this SSS, is that it? It's just a process, and now we're sort of, like you said, it's a 10-year gig that we haven't seen any progression. There's no game plan. There's nothing. But are they being held accountable by penalties, which are, cost of penalties that just become, let's say, a part of doing business?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Terry, and a tough one to answer. So I think it's fair to say that, since the site-specific standards have been issued, there has been some progress made, but probably not as much as all of us would want to see. So when you start to look at this period moving into January of 2021, I think one of the real concerns is that we're not seeing a sort of, setting the bar higher by reducing the limit of pollution that's allowed and combining that with, written right into that site-specific standard, a requirement for the companies to continue to do what they've had to do now, which is you have those active action plans and you're implementing actions to continue to work to reduce the emissions. Sometimes what happens, and some of us who've been very active on these community liaison committees will know, there's another company in the city that has one. And I mean, there are a whole lot of challenges there, but sometimes it's it's harder to find a technological fix, or they try one thing as part of the action plan and it doesn't get them to where they want to be. But that process is still happening. They're still being pressured to figure out, how do we deal with this? How do we perform better? Over the life of the site-specific standards for the steel mills, we've also seen things like, in the case of ArcelorMittal Dofasco, they used to have 3 coke plants that operated, and in 2015 they closed a really old coke plant down, which they really needed to do. So some of this too, I think, is ultimately designed to push the companies. And I always like to talk about it in simple terms. If you're driving around in a jalopy, you hit a point where, guess what? It's time to just stop driving around in the jalopy and buy a new vehicle with modern emission controls on it. I think some of what we're going to ultimately see over time is, the pressure to upgrade these facilities, but with some of them, it's going to hit a breaking point where these industries are going to need to make other decisions around their primary steel production. So I know I'm not answering your question about, fines and continuing to push. I think, if anything, we just don't want to lose, given where we're sitting now, we don't want to lose that approach where the ministry is continuing to, put the crank on them to do better and combine that with these very clear action plans. Because once they do that, they become, once they're part of a site-specific standard, they do become legal documents, and the ministry can go back to them and say, wait a minute, your action plan said you were going to do this. How come you haven't done it yet? So in many respects, that's an important piece, just in terms of giving the regulator some leverage to require action. You probably know that it's painfully rare, if ever, that we see fines levied against some of these big industrial players. We have seen some incidents where, with blast furnace releases and people getting their homes sprinkled with kish from the blast furnaces, where the ministry will fine the companies for that. Within the context of Reg 419 and these standards that we're talking about, I can tell you that we haven't seen any sort of financial penalties issued against the companies for problems here. What we have observed, and this is also an important part of the process, the companies, under Reg 419 and these site-specific standards, they've had to meet with community every quarter. And I think you've been at some of those meetings where you'll know that the companies will report back in detail about how they're doing and some of the operational requirements. And then they also have to share when some sort of operation has gone off the rails, and when that happens, they do have to take steps and corrective actions and report to the ministry on how they're doing that. So there are some things that have evolved out of the process that are good in terms of more careful tracking and more obligation to report to all of us about how things are going.
But none of them have altered your chart over the last 10 years, which is
No.
your goal.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing that's what Reg 419 is all about. So if sitting in an SSS is sort of a safety net for these companies, and in 10 years you haven't seen any progression, at what point does, like, I don't know what the governing body of 419 is, and it just sounds like a wishy-washy,
Yeah.
title for, hey, let's try to do something with this.
Yeah, and actually, David from Sault Ste. Marie may want to pipe in here, because I know in this community liaison committee meeting that he was in today, they had an interesting conversation around the company being pretty close to actually, even though their site-specific standard is set high, they're pretty close to meeting the actual standard. And David, I know that led you to ask some interesting questions, so you may want to describe that scenario as well.
Yes, okay. In fact, if you look at the regulatory limit, they're very low, and the site-specific standard often is orders of magnitude above that level. So I asked the person from the standards branch who was joining us from Toronto why they have these ridiculously low standards then. And his response was that is based on health criteria where there will be no effects. And the site-specific standards are such that they are within what is called the acceptable risk of the 1 in 10 million or 1 in 100 million, whatever metric they are using. So their perspective is these values are calculated such that they will have an acceptable risk based on the health impact. So that's what they're presenting. Now, to just respond to the previous comment, we had a situation here where the ministry had put Algoma under an order that they would have to shut down one of their batteries if they didn't improve their performance. And it was basically a threat, and they in the end did not shut it down, and the company did some improvement. How much, I just can't quite quantify it, but they do use that kind of approach to, but in the end, they tend to be more agreeable because they want to keep these industries viable, and there are really only 3 integrated steel mills in Canada, and they're all here. So it's important, and they're applying regulatory principles, but they do seem to be more in a cooperative vein than in a punitive vein.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair assessment, David, and it's very frustrating when you're sitting in the community being impacted, for sure, when you see that approach. One thing I should say, and David commenting on that threat to Algoma reminds me that here in Hamilton, ArcelorMittal, and this is kind of separate from but also intermingled with the site-specific standards, they were issued an order to rehabilitate their coke plants. And they fell behind schedule and asked for an extension of a year, which the ministry granted to them. And a number of us raised concerns about that. But they made it very clear that, if we come to the end of this 1-year extension and you're still not finished with the rehabilitation, any of the ovens that you haven't rehabilitated, you need to take out of service. And so I can tell you in that situation, the ministry did follow through with that punitive measure, and the company has to keep those ovens within one of their coke batteries offline until they've rehabilitated them, so that there's not as much impact. So they do sometimes follow through, and I guess in a sense, for the company to lose that production capacity is not a good thing. But yeah, it never quite feels like, for those of us worried about the human and environmental impacts, it never quite feels like enough. So I don't know, Terry, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering from David if 419 maybe has unrealistic levels. If he heard in his argument today, was he satisfied with what he heard? The fact that 419, like I said, it's quite possible that it has the limits that are set there are just so low and unrealistic and not necessarily a risk to health. I mean, it's obviously what you want it to be, but the site specific, if it's not that much of, they're not off as far as health risks go. Was he satisfied with what he was hearing with the numbers on the site specific levels?
Well,
Does that make
yes,
sense?
yes, his point was that based on the production levels, because there's a factor depending on how much steel you're actually producing, that your emissions are potentially going to go up. But yes, those limits are within what they consider the acceptable risk. Now, for what it's worth, and Linda does have a chart on this, I'm not sure we're going to get to it, but as I mentioned, Algoma limit is 127, but in fact, last year, 2019, they actually achieved 116 on the yearly average. So they were actually below the 120.
Right.
And I made the case, have I already said this tonight? I've said it so many times, I'm getting confused. No. Okay, I made the point that if they were able to meet the 120, then they shouldn't be given the extension to 127, because they've shown that with proper operation and maintenance, they can manage it. But the response was, well, we were at lower production that year, so when we go up to full production, the modeling shows that we would need to have 127 for us to meet it. Now, if you look at the figures Linda just showed you, Stelco is at 313. I mean, we're talking almost 3 times what our limit is. So how they can set the standard, that has changed. I guess that's why your different grades of impact are based on that concentration. But from their perspective, it's health based, and if you're the 1 in a million or 10 in a million or 100 in a million, then those are risks that seem to be acceptable. And without being a devil's advocate, I often say, if people sometimes get upset by this, but really there's likely a higher risk when you get in your car and drive to the grocery store in terms of your mortality. But that doesn't affect what we're trying to achieve here, because these are long-term chronic effects that are going to go on for years and years and have gone on. I mean, I actually grew up in Sarnia, was born there, moved to the Sioux, and Sioux, Sarnia, Hamilton. We are the armpit of Ontario for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Terry, the concern that you're raising is something that we've heard from industry as well. The argument that, for limits like the benzoate pyrene and the benzene, which are very stringent, they'll say, well, this is just not, there's no way we could meet that. But I think the challenge really emerges when you start to look at, and just reflecting back on the map that Johan showed and what he walked us through, is you end up with challenges when you have a hotspot airshed like what we have around at Hamilton's industrial core, where there are multiple sources, and you end up, as a result of that, seeing that moving away in magnitudes from that ideal goal of the 1 in a million risk from exposure to something very different. So I know for a lot of us, I think that's really what's compelling the push. And again, when you go back and you look at the chart that compares the site-specific standards for the benzene and benzoate pyrene for these plants, and they're being regulated individually, right? But we're in a community where they're both there together, emitting into the same airshed. I think there's very, very valid reason for all of us to continue to push for better than what we've got so far. And so I think I know that's certainly the message that we keep on trying to communicate to people. They may never get there. I think that's a reality that we all recognize. But I think it's fair to say they could be reducing more. And I think that's where community voices become really important in pushing to get us there. And I don't know if anyone, Johan, if you want to add to that, or if there's anyone else who wants to ask any questions about the
Linda,
detailed stuff.
Yeah, I just want to add, for the sake of the time, I I don't want to stop any of the, the great discussions, but I want to put it out there because it's on our last slide. Linda and I will gladly also take, your questions sort of offline if there maybe require a bit more specific back and forth. I would say for the sake of the timing, we're already like a good hour into it.
Okay.
Let's maybe start with a specific comment, sort of suggestions that that Linda and I worked out to walk you through there, because that's really now, this is probably our most important story we want to pass on, besides obviously the background. I mean, everything is really important, but the call to action we want to make tonight is that hopefully all of you will go on this registry. We're going to show you how to do that, and pick and choose some of those comments. Those comments will be meant to stimulate a little bit, maybe your own ideas, your own comments. If you're pressed for time, you can cut and paste them in there. It's definitely a little bit better if you customize it, but I think we should probably move through the comments and then
Yeah,
go
absolutely.
back to the Q&A, if that's fine.
And Johan, why don't you jump in and get things rolling
And
on the comments?
actually, before I do that, I want to put also out to Kathy and Paul. I saw your comment or your question that you made there. I'll gladly take that offline as well, to talk about what you asked, if that's okay with you. Okay, you just want me to talk about a couple from the top there?
Sure. Yeah, I didn't put them all up here, but I figured we could talk about some of them. And
yeah. So as I already mentioned, those are suggestions because we understand this is a highly complex subject, as we all realized already, right? It's very, very hard in an hour and a half to fill all of you in and bring you up to speed. So we kind of scratched the surface a little bit, and we thought what's probably most helpful to all of you is if we prep a few comments. Those are things that came to mind, most of them from Linda's side, some of them from my end. And so they will get you started. Like I said, you can build on those comments. Also outside the comments, we haven't really put it here in writing, but also you can also write personal stories there. I've heard from previous efforts about writing comments from people. They for instance, they say, I live across the street from your steel mill and my front porch is always black and I wipe it down every Saturday and I'm just upset about that, right? Don't think you have to be an expert and write at an expert level. You can write an emotional story. It doesn't really matter. It's important that we do something, that we give feedback to the ministry, because we know for a fact that if you give that feedback, the critical number here is probably 5 people saying the same thing. The ministry cannot discount it. We learned in the past that 5, it doesn't always have to be 5, but 5 is already a good number. We don't need hundreds of comments. It would be great, but it's unrealistic that we're going to get them. This topic is too hard to comprehend. But if 5 of us mention the same thing, it stands out on a chart, like if the ministry uses statistics and says, what have the people been saying? And it's just 1, 1, 1, 1. Okay, everything is fine. But now all of a sudden there's this bar where 6 or 7 people have been saying that same thing. Okay, somebody will zoom in and now wrap their head around it. And if we're lucky, they're going to implement it. We've had mild success with the commenting. A lot of times the ministry takes lesser items and puts them in. So let's start with the first comment. So it would be to demand that they phase in more stringent limits that require actions that lead to continuous improvement, so that the companies really have that end goal in mind to finally meet that Reg 419, so the regular air standard for everybody in Ontario, for every company outside the steel and heavy industry. because as Linda has shown in her graphs, right, there's very, very little progression. There's, sometimes a tiny bit on some of the pollutants where they get stepped down, but for most part, relatively insignificant, I would say. So that could be one of the comments, show that there is true continuous improvement, not only on a small scale, but really on a larger scale. The second one is a very, very important one. And I think that one is really, really simple to understand. We're now into the second week of December, and some of those site-specific standards expire at the end of this year. So January 1st, there would be a void if the ministry doesn't act now. So this is really a substandard timing on the ministry's part to pretty much have the commenting period until December 14th, and then there's the Christmas shutdown. So effectively, they work one more week after the commenting closes. And nobody can tell me that within that 1 week, they can effectively implement any of the comments that come in, because to be fair to the industry, usually what a regulator does is go to the industry and give them ample time to prepare for it. So that second comment here is basically that the timelines associated with a proposal to extend those site-specific standards are tight and leave you wondering whether public input is really being considered at all in a meaningful manner. Because how can you consider it if you just have 1 week and then effectively the standard has to be in place? And that comment, I would really encourage everybody to make it, because as we've learned, some of those standards don't expire until June of next year. I don't see any reason why now the government, the ministry should not wait to bring that new standard. Why not just implement it, in May, and, you give the industry a draft in February, and then they have ample time to prepare until the old one expires, and then it gets superseded by the new one. The next one is concerning about transparency with this whole process. So far, as you learned, there's these community liaison committees, and they have quarterly meetings where the industry actually shows their performance records. And so they have measurables that they show to us, and they slightly get tougher and tougher as the years go on. We want to make sure, because it's not specifically mentioned in this posting, the posting is, is a little bit vague because it's not a full application. It might be a moot point, it might be not. But again, I would encourage everybody to comment and say, we want those quarterly meetings to continue, and we want the companies to be held accountable based on those performance standards. That's the very least you can do. If you're not making them more stringent over time, if you just leave the status quo for the next 2.5 years, at least tell us how they're doing against the status quo. Because we know that on the part of ArcelorMittal Dofasco, they're still not meeting the 2020 targets, and in 2019 they never met the 2019 targets. So that leads me to wonder, when will they, really meet even 2020 targets? They may need until 2022 maybe to meet them, but I do want to know on a quarterly basis where they're at, because then we have an angle to approach them and say, okay, ministry, that's maybe not acceptable, you got to do something about it. The next one, this is along the lines of what, before I even started with specifically the comments where I mentioned, you can tell them a little bit, know your personal story. Can be like, well, I live near the plants. And you don't literally have to really live next door, because if you've seen in that earlier map, right, the pink covers all the way over to Dundas even, and large areas of the mountain here. And the yellow covers the beach neighborhood as well. But one doesn't necessarily only have to live in the beach neighborhood. So for those of you that signed on that said, you know, we're downtown, or the student, I would assume, you know, maybe over in Westdale, you're well within that area. But yeah, bring a little bit of a personal story in there, because everybody has the right to clean air that you breathe. The breathing is not by choice. We cannot change it. We can change other behaviors that are high risk behaviors, but unfortunately, we cannot really choose the air we breathe for most part. Okay,
Thanks,
Linda.
Thanks, Johan. Yeah, I was just going to add in the handout.
Take the next slide, Linda, or?
Yeah, I was just going to say in the handout that we've prepared, there are a few other ideas for comments that you could focus on, including these. So you'll find all of that in the information. Let me just, hang on, Johan, I just got to get the slide forward for you. There we go.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I thought there was a second comment page. Yeah, Linda mentioned it anyway, that we will circulate, or you can download it, I think already, right, from Environment Hamilton website.
Yeah.
We'll also post it on the CAP Facebook site, I guess. And it's a neat little summary that Linda drafted up. It pretty much has everything in there, at least to get you going for the commenting. And like I said, you'll also find our contact info, you'll find our emails, and you can ask away if you need to know a little bit more specifics about it. Most of you can probably do with that commenting sheet, and then just do the next step that I quickly gonna walk you through now. So the commenting is for most part happening online. Oh, that's not a big surprise. So basically, the sheet that Linda is circulating, that you can download off the Environment Hamilton website, has also the links to now those postings. So you want to make sure that, first of all, draft your comments in a Word document, or open some notes, etc. Make your comments outside the ministry's website. The reason for that is you will have to cut and paste if you hopefully take us up on this offer and will make multiple comments for multiple postings. Since they're essentially the same, just the company changes. ArcelorMittal Dofasco that is shown here has a benzene posting, but so does Stelco. So if you write your comments, just cut and paste them, put them in here, and then you go to the Stelco link and you open that posting again. So once you click on those links that are in our info sheet, it will take you to what you see in front of us. And in the next page, I'm going to show you, you can scroll down. But before we go to the scrolling, if you can just back up one more time. I just want to make sure everybody saw the button.
Oops, sorry.
So
there we go.
So on the left bottom, there's the blue submit a comment button. It tells you when the period closes, right? In this case, midnight, 1 minute before midnight, December 14th. You want to make sure you get your comments in before that. The system is unforgiving. You post it 1 minute later, then it won't be considered. So you press on that blue button, and then Linda, please go to the next slide. Maybe we'll just we'll stop there. This is just sort of because the cut and paste, I could not cut and paste it on one page. That first sort of landing page where you land has also those details. I circled the proposal details because you may want to read through those. If you just keep on scrolling down, you're going to arrive at those anyway. So let's assume we press the comment button from the very first page that we've seen. And Linda, go to the next page, please. So after you press the comment, you'll arrive at this page. There's now multiple options. For you, if you never made a comment there before, you probably want to choose one of the two on the right-hand side. I would encourage you to take a moment and register for an account. You'll have it easier, especially if you make multiple postings. And you also have the advantage, the system saves all your comments that you ever make on the site. for instance, if I logged in before the meeting just to kind of verify this also, then I see all the commenting I've ever done under this login. So if you have the time, you would register for an account, and then it takes you to the next step. If you're pressed for time and you want to do it without registering for whatever reason, that's the other version. It's the blue box, comment without registering. And then next slide, please, Linda. So either if you press comment without registering, you end up here. If you register for it, you'll ultimately end up at the same page. Basically, submit a comment. And where it says write your comment here, again, would encourage you that you have a parallel document. You use Microsoft Word or any other text editing that you like outside this website, and you just cut and paste it. Again, has the advantage that you can use it multiple times. Has also the advantage that you're not in the middle of a sentence, accidentally hit send, but you meant to hit the space bar or something like this. So just finish writing your comment offline, and then just cut it, paste in there, and then you submit your comment, and then you'll get a verification. Like I said, if you have an account, you'll see it that you commented on there. And once the ministry is done reviewing the comments, they will have to at one point issue the final order there as what is proposed right now. And they will also publish all the comments that came in. So then, at one point towards the end of the year, I assume, probably not very long after the commenting period closes, the ministry will probably post it for a final, and then it will be the law. But one can then still look what were all the comments that came in. That's just for sort of transparency reasons. I think that's the last slide, right, Linda? Or okay,
one more here at the bottom. Yep.
It's still that comment page, but if you were to scroll down a little bit, it gives you also the option if you had any supporting links. For instance, if you were inclined to, let's say the US standards came up, if you're inclined to sort of, take that up as your personal comment, you could put a web address here that maybe posts, Allegheny County standards, etc. If that supports your comment, basically, and then on the very bottom, you just see, support your comment. And you also have a preview button next to it if you just wanted to see, well, what does it look, before I submit. But then very important, you want to submit it and wait for the system to tell you that it took the comment, not that there's any computer glitch that holds you back from actually making that comment. And that's about it regarding the submissions. So just keep in mind, it's multiple postings, and we would really encourage you to click on each of those postings links from our info sheet, just to make sure that the comments go through to each and every single one. I know it's a little bit cumbersome and redundant, but as far as the postings are concerned, each one is treated separately from the other. And we cannot assume necessarily that if I comment for one company, that then the other company will automatically also get that. It may be the case, but we don't want to take any chances. And I'll hand it back to you, Linda.
Thanks, Johan. So just so you all know, if you go to the Environment Hamilton website now, you'll find the handout there. You can download the PDF document. So you just need to, from the homepage, click on Take Action, which is at the top, and you'll find on that page at the very top, I just uploaded today, a link to that information sheet. Also with a little bit of a reminder of that December 14th deadline. So I guess at this point, maybe we can take a few more questions, Johan. I'm gonna
Yeah,
stop
shall we-
sharing
let's
this.
open up the mic.
I'm just gonna stop sharing the screen so we can see everybody, if that's okay. Oh. Sorry, did somebody have a question?
Can anybody hear me?
Yep.
Could you repeat those things you said expire in June?
So you wanted me to repeat it,
Yeah,
or
You said
what?
some things expire in June. I know you said January 1st was the site-specific status. What were the ones you
Yes,
said
yeah.
about June?
we have the particulate matter is expiring at the end of the year, and I guess ultimately that triggered the ministry now to fast track some of the other ones. Is the manganese, Linda, correct me if I'm wrong, the manganese is also expiring at the end of this year?
I think that one's also June. I think it's just
also
the
June, right? And then the
SPM.
benzene is definitely June, and
Yeah.
benzene is not even posted, so let's not even talk about it anymore. I mean, yeah, it's of concern just because of the timeline. The particulate matter should have been discussed, I think personally, in July or August at the latest, because I'm very much for giving the industry a heads up, because that's a common practice. You know, as much as, you know, I would like to be, let's say, tough on the industry. We got to grant them obviously a fair process here. So if the industry took us up on our comments and wanted to implement, especially the continuous improvement part, I think it would be very unfair to tell the industry 2 days before Christmas, oh, by the way, on January 1st, we'll demand that you improve your whatever emissions by 10%, and then the year after by another 15%. You know, you have to give like a reasonable heads up. So therefore, the timing basically stacks the whole process a little bit against us, you know, without being too pessimistic. But it basically, I mean, one can see, you know, and read in between the lines that there is probably not much intention on the ministry's part to really do anything as the status quo. But we got to make our voices heard, because if we don't do that, then for sure it will remain as it is. So that can be a strong point. You'll see it on the postings when they expire. And in Linda's info sheet, she has that nice table. If you go in the table, you see on the top there the dates. So if you just take a moment, because you know, it's a little bit overwhelming, right? You know, it's a 1 hour and a half now of pretty intense talks, right, about an intense technical subject, and then even the commenting is you know, is quite a formal process, right? And there's a lot involved in that. So
Okay, thank you.
any other comments out there or questions?
Terry, you're muted, Terry. Sorry, I can see that you're talking, but we can't hear you.
My friends would like that option if they had it with me. I'm on the environment-hamilton.org site. So can you just walk me through what I'm
Sure.
downloading again there? You said to download the
Yeah,
PDF.
so if you go to, did you hit on the tab that says take action? So that you
Yes.
get to that page? Okay. So at the very top of that page, you should see something that talks about site-specific standards for Stelco and Dofasco. And then right below that title, there's a sentence that starts with click here. So if you click here, it'll download, you'll see that you can open up the PDF document that way.
Yeah, and that just gives me the information sheet that you initially started with,
Yeah, so that should give you, it's 4 pages of information.
right?
So it's all of what we talked about tonight, but in even more detail.
Okay, but this wasn't where we were actually submitting our comments. No, this was just.
No, sorry. This is just my sheet to help you, but
Got
it
it.
does have live links. So when you open up the PDF, if you click on, we've
Yeah, I see it.
provided a list of the 4 postings, and you can click on the links to take you to the page where you do submit your
Yeah.
comments to the ministry. Yeah, we tried to make it as easy
Misunderstood
for
that.
all of you as we possibly could.
No, it's perfect.
Great.
I think I understand it.
Yeah, excellent. And feel free, we've included both of our emails at the end of that doc. So for sure, people should feel free to reach out to us with any questions. You know, even if you need help walking through, if you've never used the registry before. I think Johan and I are old pros at this point, right? We'll be happy to help anybody with that too.
At some point, I guess I'd be interested in, and I'll do a little bit more research myself, but in understanding how the Reg 419, where those numbers, how they were originated, you know, and were they chemists that, environmental chemists who sat down with these industries and actually came up with these numbers and found them to.
Yeah, and just very quickly, so you know, those numbers are established through a whole in-depth process, and it's ministry staff. They have epidemiologists and other, you know, toxicologists who do all kinds of work looking at other jurisdictions, looking at the health implications. So there are, and if you want, you know, I'd be happy to provide you with one. You'll likely be able to find online. The ministry has almost what amount to like justification documents for when they do set those standards, and they share all the details about why, from a health and environmental protection point of view, they've landed where they have. So there is a whole big process that they go through to set each of those standards.
And do the industries have an opportunity to dispute those findings?
Trying to think if they actually post that. You know, they do go through, I think they actually do. And remind me, Johan, it's been a while, but you know, I think about benzene and benzoate pyrene, and those standards didn't actually come into force until 2015, 2016. And I think as part of that sort of finalization of that, there were opportunities to comment through the environmental registry. So anybody could comment.
Right. Yeah. And they should be met.
Yeah, and I mean, it may well be there. I think there have always been some grumblings around, oh, health-based is not the way we should do this because it's too hard for us, you know. Yeah, so I think there have been some lingering sorts of tensions over the approach here. And I think you'll find, depending on which jurisdiction you're in, there are very different approaches. So if we were in the States, you know, there are a lot of jurisdictions where they automatically say, no matter what, you got to put all this pollution control technology on. And Ontario has taken a much more conciliatory approach where they've said, no, we're going to help you to prioritize which are the most problematic sources, and we'll make you deal with those, but we're not necessarily going to make you blanket put control on everything. So there are some who will say it's better to make them put the controls on everything. You end up with greater reductions. Others who will say that's crazy. So it seems to vary from, even within North America, from province to province and state to state. So it gets messier the deeper you dig, I think.
And is it just primarily outdated equipment that causes this? So if there were technology on new filtration systems and things like that, that would possibly solve some of these numbers?
I think oftentimes, yeah. So when you look at, you know, those coke ovens, I know that Dofasco, ArcelorMittal Dofasco's coke plants are, if not the oldest, some of the oldest in North America, and they've been working to refurbish. Stelco Hamilton Works, we know from the data that they've shared, they've got probably the best performing coke plant in the province right now, even though they're still not where we want them to be. But the probably the only more modern comparators we have is we're aware of at least one very new coke plant in Clairton, Pennsylvania, and that's US Steel, and they're using a different kind of technology. But it sounds like, you know, it hasn't turned out to be as great as they were hoping. I think if anything, we've seen, you know, if you look at the European, at the EU, there's a lot more progress there with newer steelmaking technology, lower emissions, and I think fair to say some of the plants in China that are brand new, where they're building brand new, if it's primary steel production, right from the coke making through to blast furnaces and everything else, the newer technology is better. And then there's a transition towards trying to get rid of, sources like coal altogether. And are there other cleaner carbon sources?
Carbons,
So,
yeah.
so some of that is happening, but it feels like we're behind here again on that one.
Right. And I just one last question. So as far as capacity goes with production capacity within these facilities, sorry, are they at full capacity, or is there any future of them pulling out of Hamilton and closing up some of these plants, or as a result of very old coke ovens, let's say, is it cost effective to stay here for them in the economy? I'm not sure.
Did you wanna take a stab at that one, Johan?
Sure, yeah. We know that Dofasco, at least as of 2 years ago, they told us that they've been running the last, I believe it was 5+ years, at overcapacity. They were running between 105 of 110% of what theoretically the plant can output. 110% theoretically is not possible, but obviously what they mean is they've had way fewer downtimes for maintenance, repairs, etc., than normally you would have. Business has been very good for them. Obviously, the last 2 years or any time under the Trump presidency has been tough times for steel producers. Especially here in Canada, right? Because of the tariffs that overnight got slapped on, then taken off, and then stated. From what I know, business at Dofasco is very, very good. I can only assume it's a very profitable plant. Makes also sense because relatively low investment cost in repair and refurbishing. They will definitely, if they hear me quote a quote of my comment. But I would say in industry comparison, for instance, they tell us the last 5 years their coke operation needed a major overhaul, and they pegged the price tag at, I don't know, $65 million or something like this. And earlier in the spring, there was an announcement from Stelco that they're going to make also some improvements, but at the Nanticoke plant on Lake Erie, around the coke ovens and a little bit related, and it's $85 million spent in just 1 year. Theoretically, I don't know if it really happened all to this year. So I think Dofasco is really kind of running a very, very efficient plant there. It's owned by a global steel giant. I think they're one of the number 2 or 3 steel plants in the world. They own multiple plants. They're headquartered in Luxembourg. They've been buying up, over the last 10 years, steel plants pretty much anywhere that have been going out of production. They have some good ways of bringing them back to life and finding customers. Here they mainly supply the automotive industry with a little bit kind of higher end steels for North America. So Stelco, we know they came out of bankruptcy protection just 2 years ago, but they have pretty deep pockets because the investors that took it over brought a lot of money to the table, and they've been able to raise a lot of funds on the stock market since, and are heavily reinvesting right now to gear up, I guess, for even better times. So I think their sales have gone up a fair bit. And the current owners probably in the short to midterm, I think they probably want to sell this plant again, because they're not like a traditional steel company. They're like an investment fund that specializes in taking over struggling companies. Mainly, they have expertise in the steel sector. They've done this before, but they're probably not in it for the long run, where Dofasco clearly, that's their bread and butter. That's pretty much all they do is steel all around the world. So they're in it for the long run. With Stelco, we could see an ownership change, but if that happens, it's probably going to be, I would assume, much different than that last bankruptcy protection. It will be probably not like a fire sale. It will be probably a very profitable sale and somebody else will take it over. But
Right.
I think right now, I don't think that in the short term, any of those plants will disappear. We have to see with Sault Ste. Marie a little bit, right? There's some problems there at Algoma. But the federal government has strong intentions of obviously keeping steel production alive in Canada for strategic reasons.
Sure.
And that will always ultimately be a big factor when it comes to, let's say, hurting the steel industry too much, may it be through environmental regulations or tariffs, etc. So, so I don't see that in the short term any of those companies will disappear, because Stelco looks pretty strong, and like I said, so does Dofasco, at least here for the Southern Ontario area. With Algoma Steel, I'm not sure, David, you can probably add some there, but it's a strategic industry. So we shouldn't kid ourselves that this is anything that the government would just let go under, just like that. You know,
Right.
they would work very hard. I mean, they've been very helpful at helping Stelco under the bankruptcy protection to make sure that they reemerge. And I'm pretty sure they would do it for, you know, the other steel mills too.
And if coke ovens are being rebuilt at the cost of, you know, $100 million, is the ministry oversee that build? I mean, is there some sort of governing body that can implement, you know,
Yes.
environmental technology to?
Well, we have to see also, we did a sort of a, you know, a simplistic presentation tonight. Those site-specific standards have multiple other orders attached to it, and those orders talk a little bit more specifically about, you know, a subset of technical area within the facility. So all of those companies have, you know, while it looks on the surface on the site-specific standards that there's, regarding the values at least of those contaminants, very little improvement, they still have to follow through a regime. So when it comes to those upgrades that I mentioned on Dofasco's part, yes, there's a detailed breakdown. They present also quarterly to us, and they have, like, you know, let's say 100 action items, and it's all broken down, you know, on this door, I got to put a new seal, and on this exhaust, there's a hole, I got to weld that, etc. It's relatively prescriptive. The ministry oversees it, not down to every nut and bolt, but when it says, you know, general items on there, you got to put a new door seal, the ministry would want to see, you know, some sort of record. Okay, you've really done it, right?
Right.
Because those prescriptive elements, the ministry believes, will ultimately lead to better air emissions. Because I also want to mention, you know, when it comes to, Linda mentioned a little bit, comparing in the world, what other facilities are out there, are they better, etc. What here, especially Dofasco, what they're dealing with on the coke oven batteries are, I mean, they're very big pieces, but essentially, technically, they're very trivial and simple things. They're not simple to fix, but they're, for instance, the door doesn't close properly, therefore it leaks. And those leaks have high benzene, benzoate, and can have particulate leaking out. So it's obviously not good. So the ministry would say, you got to improve your door. So now if we imagine a brand new facility, most likely the door will seal properly and will not leak for the first 10 or 20 years. And the same goes for elements that capture the exhaust fumes when you open the door that come out, and for things that channel the heat under those. Those are all like steel ducts that have corroded through and have holes, which again make it easy for emissions to find their way to the atmosphere, and then it comes outside and ends up in the community. So they're dealing with really, I mean, a lot of neglect. So a brand new facility, even if it was built to that same, with that same technology, would be obviously, you know, multiple times better than this. But nowadays you obviously would rebuild it with, you know, hopefully a newer technology because there's better things available. But I would say technically they play on a kind of a very, very low level because the environmental regulation allows for it, and quality wise they can cope with that level. That level is still good enough to make competitive steel, to make high quality steel. The pollution factor doesn't play in there all that much. It plays in if you want to make super, super high-end product, but if you want to make a run-of-the-mill product and you want to make a lot of it, then those environmental concerns not necessarily degrade your product all that much.
Perfect, thank you.
Anybody else with comments? If not, I would say we can probably close it here just for the sake of time. It's been already a long evening. Like Linda mentioned, our emails are mentioned in that info sheet, so we'd encourage you to download that. And if you had any specific questions, contact either Linda or myself. We'll gladly help you out. And from my side, yeah, want to thank all of you for participating. That's been a really impressive turnout. So thanks so much for making yourself available during this time and listening to us. And I'm counting on you to make your comments and get lots of comments up there on the website there. And I'll hand over to Linda.
Yeah, thanks, Johan. Yeah, I would echo Johan's comments. Thank you for spending tonight talking steel pollution with us, and really encourage you to take the time to submit your comments. And we'll hope from that we can push the ministry to do more for us. And again, you know, I should also say, you know, we're pushing hard for this industry to do better. And our goal, sometimes we get accused of trying to shut them down. And I think all of you who know us and work with us know that's not our goal here. We want to make these local industries, you know, make sure they transition into the modern age and they become sustainable operations for their sake as much as ours. So, you know, I always say to people, think about that too when you're submitting your comments. Yeah, we hope you do take the time to do that. And thanks again, everybody, and have a good evening.
Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you from Sue.
Thank you,
Thank
David,
you.
for joining us.
Thank you.
It's good to at least virtually meet you.
Night, Linda.
Good night.